Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's 1 p.m. here in Colombia, where I am. I think it's morning for some of you, as I'm seeing some West Coasters and lots of people from other parts of the world. So welcome. It's great to have you all here. My name's Joe Brewer, and I'm your host today. And this is part of the free webinar series for the Earth Regenerators Study Group. And today, we're going to be talking about land ownership as it relates to Earth regeneration. And this is a topic that is really deeply important to me personally, and I think you'll see why I feel that way as we get into the discussion and the presentation soon. It's looking like Brian is having some difficulty with audio. Is anyone else having problems with audio? So could you let me know in the chat box? If you can hear me okay. Just give like a +1. And if you can't hear me, then a -1. And we'll see if it's working. +1, okay, so it looks like for several people we're getting some good audio. So thank you for that feedback. Brian, one thing you might try doing is refreshing your browser. Just hit the refresh button and sometimes that does the trick. So as we've done with the previous webinars, this one's number 4. In what is a growing series. What we're going to do today is have a presentation period where I will share some slides and give a talk that will last for somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes. And then we'll have an extended discussion period that can last up to an additional 90 minutes afterwards. So we've gone the full 2 hours each of the previous times we've done these webinars. And I will check in with you as we go along about if we feel like using all of the time or part of the time as we go. And for those of you who are new, I'd like to draw your attention to the phrase at the bottom of the screen that says ask a question. Because when the presentation is happening, you can go to ask a question and post a question, or you can go and start voting on the questions you'd like to hear answered. And then also when the presentation portion is over, what we will do is use the ask a question feature to help organize our discussions. So I'll be able to invite whomever asked the question into a split screen for us to do a video dialogue. And we've had technical problems with that sometimes in the past, and it's worked well at others. So we'll try it again today and see how it works. But the idea is that during the presentation portion, you will have the opportunity to ask questions by going to the Ask a Question button at the bottom. And then you can also vote for all the questions you'd like to hear answered, and we'll answer them in the order of the popularity based on the number of people who would like to have them answered. So just as a brief introduction for those of you who might be new to this group, my name is Joe Brewer, and I helped organize a study group called Earth Regenerators, which you can join by hitting the Join the Study Group button below the video screen. And it's a free group to join that's approaching 600 members. It's around 570 members at the moment of people all around the world who are interested in participating in the regeneration of the Earth. And these webinars are freely given in the spirit of a gift economy. I'm supported on Patreon by many people who enable me to do this work without asking for compensation. So I'm really glad to be able to tell all of you that this is a gift that I offer, and I hope that it's useful and valuable for you. So again, the session today is going to be organized in 2 parts. I'll be giving a brief presentation lasting for 20 to 30 minutes using some slides that I've prepared. And during that time, you can ask questions. Then afterwards, we'll have an extended Q&A and discussion period where people can pose questions or offer conversation topics. And I have the ability with the Crowdcast platform to invite us into a one-on-one conversation with whomever asked those questions. So with that said, I'd really like to get started with the presentation portion of today's webinar. And I want to say that in previous webinars, I've talked about our planetary predicament, and I'm just going to assume for the sake of discussion today that we have a shared understanding that we have a very tremendously degraded planetary ecology. Our biosphere has been tremendously compromised by human activities, and that cultural evolutionary processes led by human beings have helped this to happen. And we're going to see a specific lens and a specific piece of history related to this cultural evolutionary process today. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. I'll share my screen and begin the video portion or the presentation portion of our discussion. So let's see, there we go. This portion, we are ready for the presentation. So the study group that is hosting Earth Regenerators is being organized around an emerging organization called the Design Institute for Regenerating Earth, which principally does the study group and webinar activities at this point in time. And so we're just getting started figuring out what this institute is. But I wanted to name that this is in the process of emerging, and all of you here are co-creators of it with your participation in this webinar. So thank you so much for being here. The topic I want to talk about today is land ownership, but I want to enter into it in a way that may be a little bit different. I want to start by saying there's something interesting about human beings. Human beings are animals. We're part of the biosphere. We evolved like every other animal on the planet, and we share a great deal in common with other animals. Yet, we have this amazing cognitive ability to imagine dreams and project that imagination onto the world, and then act out our imagination as if it were true. And this allows us to alter the world so that it becomes more like our dreams. This is an amazing ability that we have, an extremely powerful capacity. And that if we are sleepwalking, if we're dreaming without being aware that that's what we're doing, then our dreams can wreak havoc on the world without us having any idea that it is our own imaginations that are creating the problem. And we're going to see that as profoundly true for land ownership in just a moment. As we can see with this quote from Chief Seattle, when he said, "When the blood in your veins returns to the sea, and the earth in your bones returns to the ground, perhaps then you will remember that this land does not belong to you. It is you who belong to this land." It's an amazing ecological fact that human beings are the cycling flow of nutrients of ecosystems who come from the earth, remain ever a part of the earth, and return as we die and become composted and distributed back into the ecosystems, that we become very much an undifferentiated part of the earth after we die. So it's a strange idea to say that humans can own the land, when the reality is we are owned by it. So if that is the truth, then how is it that we've come to believe that we can own the land? So this gets back to that human capacity for dreaming. We dreamed this into being, and we constituted it into law. We created a world where our forests were cut down, the pastures and grazing land were fenced off, and they became separated from each other and ecologically disconnected into these massively degraded landscapes, because some human beings imagined the world as being privately owned parcels of land. Now, the question I ask is, what are the consequences of this dream becoming our reality? And the answers are seen in the planetary boundaries framework that I've talked about in previous webinars. There's a mass extinction event that we are entering into with a rapid increase in the number of species going extinct, mostly because of this degradation and destruction of ecosystems. There is a loss of topsoils all over the planet due to accelerated erosion and accelerated cycling of nutrients that are dumping into the world's ocean. There is an increase in an explosion of toxic chemicals, especially herbicides, pesticides, hormone disruptors, and other things that are spread across these landscapes into the waterways and circulated across the planet. So this ability to dream of the world as being owned by humans, and then to enact that dream the way that actors might enact a play, has resulted in our landscapes looking like this, and our biosphere being harmed in these ways. The pattern looks like this if you see its core logic. That there's a pattern of ecological destruction that comes about when land is privatized and turned into a system of extraction for private and personal gain. This includes the death of indigenous life systems, where indigenous life here is the ability to live deeply in a place with the responsibility to steward the land for future generations. When people privately own land, they can happily destroy it and use up its ecological value, and then throw it away and cast it aside, use the monetary wealth that they gained by doing so to then move to another parcel of land and repeat the process. Of course, those who own the land gain, and those who are displaced from the land lose. So this creates an increasing intensification of structural inequality, which includes making impoverished those who are displaced or those who are enslaved in these extractive land processes, which of course only enhances the ability of any system that does this to engage in ecologically destructive practices. And what I want to say here that's extremely important is that this is a self-terminating thought form. This is an idea. This idea of owning land is nothing more than an idea that we have dreamed into being without realizing that we were dreaming. But it is, as you can see from this logic, it is self-terminating. Anything that increases, and especially anything that accelerates exponentially the destruction of ecosystems, while making the people involved increasingly incapable of cooperating to restore ecological health, is going to eventually destroy itself, which is what we see happening now with our globalized economic system. So this is a runaway thought form, a runaway dream turned into a nightmare that is running amok across the entire planet. And I mean the entire planet. The reason that I chose this view of the Earth is that you can see what we present day, what we call the Middle East, this area where Saudi Arabia is, and then up north into Iraq and Afghanistan and all of those places. And what you'll notice is that it all looks like desert. The reason for that is that for roughly 5,000 years in this part of the world, people have been engaging in extractive practices by building empires and civilizations, and then more recently, fossil fuel-driven industrial economies that have degraded these landscapes to such an extent that you can see widespread desertification from outer space. There's a name for this runaway thought pattern. In the Algonquin language, and the Algonquins are the people of basically the First Nations people of the New England area and into Nova Scotia. So there's people of the northeastern part of North America. They have a concept that they call wetiko. And for them, wetiko is a spiritual concept for a cannibalistic spirit that is driven by greed, excess, and selfish consumption. Now, in the Ojibwa language, it's called Wendigo, and it's called Wintiko in the Powhatan. So you can see that this concept had such widespread use across North America that many different cultures gave it their own name. The important thing about Wetiko is that the First Nations people used it to describe the cultural sickness of the European explorers when they arrived, which is why in the book by Jack Forbes, he called it Columbus and Other Cannibals. How the native people talked about Columbus as a big Wetiko, a person who embodied this cannibalistic spirit, which you can see from his diaries and from his life actions, that he very much was a rape and pillage kind of person. The thing about Wetiko is that it is an element of human psychology. It's the capacity to imagine the world projected from our minds without knowing that it is our minds projecting the imagination. So Wetiko deludes its host. It tricks the person into believing that cannibalizing the life forces of others is logical and a morally upright way to live. When in reality, this belief in cannibalizing the life force of others is self-terminating. It eventually destroys so much of the life system that the host person depends upon for their survival that it eventually takes away the capacity for that person to survive as well. And this is the runaway cultural process that threatens us with human extinction right now. So Wetiko is an indigenous diagnosis of the cultural pathology that is so exemplified in land ownership. This idea that humans are separate from nature and that we can mindlessly consume it to our heart's extent. And a really popular place to think about how this began is in what is called the enclosure movement in 17th century Britain, which is a time when, very ironically, what was called the House of Commons introduced a new legal framework that allowed the aristocracy to claim ownership and deed over commonly shared and commonly managed pasture lands, forcing the people who lived there, where their ancestors had been there for 1,000 years or more, forcing them off the land and only allowing them back if they would come as wage laborers. And then these owners could charge rent on the land for the wage laborers to live there and work the land. Now, many of these farmers were forced off of the land because they couldn't afford to live there, and they ended up becoming a cheap labor force in the burgeoning industrial factories of the cities in places like London and in Berlin and Paris. So at this time of the enclosure movement, there was a very intentional implementation of a legal framework of forced displacement of people, hoarding and acquisition of land, and wealth accumulation. Interestingly, the consequence of this was that the word poverty entered the English language, and mass poverty was first observed within the Western European context, where a large majority of people in this area were not able to engage in subsistence ways of living. So their indigenous way of life, or their way of life as a system engaged in the land, was destroyed by this process. The process of enclosure went like this, and it became modernized and, I would say, weaponized with fossil fuel-based industrialism in the 20th century. So this first step is to either kill or displace local people who had stewarded the land for a long time. So here you can see this applies to Britain in the 17th century, but it also applies to all forms of colonialism and the enslavement that was a part of colonial systems. So when the Spanish came to what's present day called Central and South America, they killed or displaced the people who had lived here. Same thing for the Europeans who came to North America, and for the Europeans who, quote unquote, conquered many parts of Africa. So they kill or displace the local people who historically stewarded the land because they believed themselves to be part of it. Then they define the land exclusively in productive use, as productive use in extractive terms. So you start to see the land as a place for landowners to think about what they can take and keep for themselves. And notice the logic of Wetiko here, how it's cannibalizing the land for what is now called natural resources, turning all of the living systems of the earth into resources to be extracted and consumed. And then, as these owners of land can now play the game of using the money that they have gathered from all of these extractive processes, they can buy other pieces of land and then charge rent from other people to use the land, so they can engage in land speculation practices to make the land more valuable or to throw away the land that is less valuable and just ignore it, increasing their personal wealth as they go, with the end result being that as of today, there are about 1,400 people who are billionaires, and there are only 6 individuals, and they're all white men, who own half of the world's private wealth. So this game has come to an extreme endpoint and is extremely fragile and on the verge of collapse. And it has been grounded in a foundation of land ownership over the last 300 years. So this process, when we look at it another way, is this logic of land ownership as it relates to Wetiko, is one of starting with an earlier model of imperial conquest, to then building up stratified societies that are able to send people off to extract the materials and enslave the peoples from other lands. And that then this got modernized through industrialism and through various financial and corporate forms of legal ownership into present-day capitalism, which takes many forms around the world. And then the specific thought form of neoliberalism, which is something that we may talk about in the Q&A. But I just want to say that this pattern of conquering land, claiming ownership of it, and then spreading outward to colonize and extract from other lands, and then formalizing it into a financial, legal ownership system, which is what capitalism is is a financial and legal ownership system, is the logic of this process. And so it too is self-terminating. Where did this come from, this thought logic? Well, the most prevalent form comes from the ancient Greeks. Back in the time of people like Plato, you can see that they began to create a philosophical worldview that separated humans from the rest of nature. And this separation of humans from nature, which is a mythological thing, it's not actually true, but this idea of separation is a form of wetiko. It is the imagination that we're separate, perceived and imagined onto the world, and then the observational data through the cognitive biases of the human mind only gather information that confirms this bias. As this bias becomes more pronounced, the society begins to organize itself around the separation of humans from nature, which leads to wealth hoarding and land conquering and domination activities, which allows for human societies to form into stratified classes of people, which means we go from separating humans from nature in largely egalitarian human communities to very non-egalitarian, unequal societies where we can treat different kinds of humans as separate from each other, which is that same wetiko logic, the delusion of a person to believe that they are different from other people so that they can control and exploit and extract from the labor of those other people, is what happens in these stratified caste systems. As we continue forward, then we create a legal framework enforced by the military capacities and the court systems of these stratified societies. They've already assumed humans are separate from nature, and they've further assumed that different kinds of humans are separate from each other based on their political and economic roles. That now frameworks of private ownership can be set up where the ownership is only available to quote unquote citizens, which in the early days was land-owning men. So the men who had ownership of the land were the only people who could benefit from these extractive systems, which we then generalized in various ways, in a sense democratized this process with modern era and with the Enlightenment and the emerging democracies of the last 200 years. But we democratized a system that was based on wetiko. We invited an increasing number of people to own, extract, and destroy nature for personal gain, which is what consumer markets, consumer marketing, and consumer capitalism have done in the last 70 to 80 years. This led to the creation of vast systems of wealth extraction that have destroyed and mined the natural wealth and bounty of the planet and converted it into privately hoarded wealth and power of increasingly tiny and stratified elites in increasingly unequal and corrupt societies. All of it enabled by land-owning men, historically, generalizing this pattern of privatized ownership to accelerate the process of wealth extraction. And that has led to this. Landscapes that are visible even from airplanes and from outer space. You can see that this cannibalizing of the land has taken over something like 40%, 37, 38% of the land surface of the earth, while also mining and extracting the marine ecosystems of the world ocean, destabilizing the earth system, causing climate change and the mass extinction event that we're entering into. All of it driven by these extractive processes because the human mind imagined itself to be separate from the land. I want to give a very specific example in the place where I live, because this is in the northern Andes of Colombia. You can see on the left is Barichara, which is the place where I'm living right now. And I'm going to draw a circle around this plateau because you can see that below this circle is a river running from Sand Hill and going down to the left. And if you go up where Jordan is in Los Santos, you'll see there's another river valley that's going east to west or right to left. And if you see where Guane is, it's in a river valley. That river runs from south to north or bottom to top of the image. So this circle that I've drawn is a plateau that 30 or 40 years ago, it was an intact tropical dry forest. Right now, you can see from these satellite images, this is taken from Google Earth, that the landscape has been almost entirely deforested. All of the rivers, and I've counted more than 15 tributaries of the river systems on this plateau, almost all of them have run dry, and they're dry for 10 months of the year, and they've gone underground. So this is a landscape that has been cannibalized and killed, and it was done for growing and selling tobacco, which of course further harms and kills human beings, and was tremendously enhanced in getting people to use tobacco through unethical and dishonest marketing practices, which we now know to be the public relations of tobacco firms from the same PR firms that later lied about climate change. So this process of making a live, vibrant ecosystem into a desert, as is happening now, is all due to private landowners coming in and either growing tobacco or engaging in agricultural practices, like raising cattle, for example, on the grasslands from the displaced forest, have destroyed this landscape. And those of us living here are trying to figure out how to regenerate it and bring it back to life, while all of this private land ownership continues to exist and to fragment the landscape. So it's very difficult to coordinate our efforts. But if you zoom in to the level of Barichara itself, the city where we're living, you can see this thing called Bioparque Mancora, which is the kind of tannish yellow color in the upper left of the image. That is a 6-hectare, or roughly 15-acre piece of land that is owned by a cooperative, an association of about 40 families that live in the town. And they made the decision that instead of turning it into housing development, that they would make it into a community food forest. Also, the green dotted line, what's called Cinturon Verde, or the green belt, is the ecologically connected corridors that still surround the city, or about 80% of the city. What's amazing is all of this land is now cooperatively owned. It has been removed from the private land market. And there are restoration projects happening, including some that my family is participating in. And what's interesting is how easily we can participate in regenerative practices on this community land, but how difficult it would be for us to illegally walk onto the private land of another person and try to restore the forest there. And I think there's a big lesson in that. So this idea of removing land from the private market and putting it into cooperatively owned structures is something that's very much real and is being done in many places around the world right now, including where we are living in Barichara. So the question becomes, is it even possible to regenerate the earth without evolving beyond private land ownership? Now, I realize that there are two ways to answer this question. One is to imagine a world where there's no land ownership at all. We've completely gotten beyond it. Another is a kind of bridge or a hybrid where we do a sort of culture hacking on private land ownership, where people privately own land, but they've set up some kind of legal agreements that change how they're able to use it. And what I want to suggest is that that nuance of both and is what I think is the way forward. We're going to have a very difficult time ridding the world of private land ownership in the next 50 to 100 years. But we might have a much easier time making use of existing land ownership frameworks to then create contracts and agreements among those who own the land to cooperatively share and manage it, which in effect nullifies or creates a barrier between private land ownership and cooperatively owned land ownership. And I want to give a couple of examples of how this can work. So first of all, there's the there's the idea of a community land trust, which is when a set of people come together, buy a piece of land or buy several pieces of land, and set up a legal framework that does not allow them to resell it and requires them to have a shared decision-making structure about how to manage it. So community land trusts are now commonly used for things like co-housing, where 30 or 40 families might buy a piece of land together, have a shared agreement that no one owns the land, but everyone owns access to built infrastructure on the land. And the way that this works is the first step is to remove the land from the private market, to buy the land and set up some kind of a legal protection so that the land is not able to be resold. Step 2 is to build a cooperative structure where several people, it could be 2 or it could be 2 million, who cooperate to own and manage the land through some kind of a decision-making framework. Step 3 is to then give the land some regenerative goals. For example, providing affordable housing, creating community gardens and organic food production, reforestation and restoring the land, or other such regenerative goals. And then step 4 is to track the value that gets created from all these regenerative practices so that they can be reinvested in the land itself and those who own it. And if you do all 4 of these steps, you've moved from a community land trust to a cooperative land bank. A cooperative land bank is when you use the land itself as if it was a bank. The land has inherent value, and if you make improvements to the land, those improvements have value. So now you can recognize that value as categories of value. So they could become subsidies, they could become money available for loans, they could become credits that people get to work toward goals of investing in things together. And so that the land itself, with the cooperation and how to govern it, creates a circulation of value as it's created and as it's managed on the land itself, which is exactly the opposite of what private land ownership and wealth extraction have done over the last several hundred years. So this is an idea that is of general applicability. You could create community land trusts and cooperative land banks that have 1,000 different forms in 1,000 different places, but all of them are doing these basic things. And notice how step 1 is to keep the land from being able to be exploited for private land speculation. If a private owner or a couple of private owners owned the land and they're able to resell it, then after value has been created by the regenerative goals, they could just cash out and then walk away, and some other owner may not have those goals, and they might very quickly begin extracting and destroying the land. So for this to be able to work in a permanent or ongoing way, structures like land trusts need to be put in place to keep the land from ever being sold again. And this is a really important step in the process. At even larger scales, you could imagine this being done for an entire watershed or mountain range, as is being developed by the Regen network, where they might look at an initial state of the land where it's heavily degraded. And then they have some measurable changes of state. For example, reforestation, capturing and storing carbon, filtering and holding water in the landscape, removing toxins, growing agroforestry products, growing medicinal and pharmaceutical products, and so on. Any kind of regenerative goals that are created in the ecosystems of the land, they are valuable. So if you can measure the improvements from an initial degraded state to a later regenerated state, then you can set up the equivalent of a community land bank on an entire territory. And now what you have is a bioregional investment platform, an entire platform of value creation and circulation measured with really good monitoring and accounting tools to regenerate landscapes and track their flows so that they continually support further regeneration. And this is something that the Regen Network is doing. They're using blockchain technology, and they're working primarily with regenerative farming and regenerative forestry. But I think this approach has broader applications than even this, which is actually quite a lot. So I just wanted to say that this idea of community land trusts and community land banks can become much more dynamic and much more intelligent with frameworks like what the Regen Network is developing. Now, a more concrete example that's already being developed. Well, actually, let's step back for a second. Let's see how this way of taking private land and moving it into cooperative ownership structures, setting regenerative goals and beginning to track the value so that the circulation of value can be reinvested in the land itself, it actually reverses this process. It converts ecological destruction into ecological regeneration. It goes from having a death of indigenous life to a rebirth of indigenous life. And this happens because more people will have sustainable livelihoods and they can continue to live in the land. They're no longer displaced where they have to go to the city and find a job. And instead of structural inequality, it creates a pathway of structural integration. As more people participate in shared ownership, and as more people participate in the creation of value through regenerative practices, they gain more access to the value that's created, and they create decision-making practices that are increasingly cooperative so that everyone becomes integrated into the regenerative goals. And this moves from creating poverty to creating flourishing, where the humans, the ecosystems, the non-human species, all are going from a lower quality of life to a higher quality of life. And notice how this is a life-affirming thought form. So if we want to replace the Wetiko dynamics that have destroyed so much of the earth, then we need to put into place ownership structures, legal structures, practices, narratives, social roles into frameworks that affirm and encourage the existence of life, which is exactly what regeneration is about. Now, as an example of this in practice that I find really inspiring is the Black Sheep Regenerative Resource Management Group, which is a group of people in Costa Rica, and they're friends of mine, and I've been working with them. They have found a way to take private land, convert it into cooperatives, and create regenerative business models that do exactly what I just described. So as you can see, their model regenerates and protects the earth. They prioritize the welfare of local people, and they perpetuate broad ownership of land, people owning it together. They do this through agroforestry practices and permaculture, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. One of their projects is called Verde Energia Pacifica, which is a 20-acre farm that was founded in 2006, so it's approaching 15 years old. What they did is they took a private piece of land owned by a guy from Oregon, a US citizen who moved to Costa Rica. His name's Joshua Hughes. Joshua owned this piece of land. Then he later learned that there was this really clever thing you can do in Costa Rican land ownership, which is that you can write contracts as part of the sort of mission statement or the statutes of the deed, just like you can for a company to write things into its bylaws. Into the ownership document, the deed itself, you can write in restrictions that include issuing shares. So he contacted a bunch of his friends in Oregon and said, I've got this 20-acre piece of land. I'd really like to regenerate it with permaculture practices. I don't have the money to do that. I need to hire permaculture designers. It's going to be years before we have a profit. I need help raising the money for this. So he reached out to friends, and they grew from one owner to 56 owners. So there's one document that says the land is owned. It is held by a company called Black Sheep Resource Regenerative Management Company. And then it is managed by these 56 shareholders who collectively own the land. And what they've done is they've been able to invest this money in regenerative agroforestry practices. So this is Verde Energia from the air. And what you can see is that they've actually, this place 15 years ago was completely deforested. It was all grassland. They've put in almost all of the trees that you see in this picture through active regeneration practices using permaculture. And they focus specifically on a ground cover crop using turmeric, which is a high value superfood that they can use, they can sell as a health food product and as a pharmaceutical product that's completely organic and is very healthy. So they're creating human health enhancing products by regenerating the health of the landscape, by pooling money together with their friends after taking private land and turning it into a cooperative. So humans, remember, we are animals with this cognitive ability to imagine something and project it onto the world and alter it to become like our dreams. Well, here at Verde Energia, Joshua Hughes imagined this land being cooperatively owned, healing the landscape while creating livelihoods for people. And now, 15 years later, they're doing it. This is real, this is happening, and this is possible. And there are a lot of other examples than this one. Just wanted to share Verde Energia because it's one I know quite a lot personally. So if we can believe this and we can dream it into being, then we can make it happen, which is a really powerful thing. So what if we created a new dream together? That if we went from people collectively extracting and destroying the planet, to coming together and creating frameworks of cooperation to manage the healing of the land until the earth itself is restored. What if we remember that we are part of the earth, the life, all the living things on the earth are our family. As we know biologically to be true, we're all part of the ancestral web of life on this planet. But we have the opportunity to be the responsible family members who care for and support the life of everyone else in our extended family. And we can do this by creating regenerative economic systems with cooperative land ownership. Now I want to end with a quote from Chief Seattle that's in greater length, when he said, "How can you buy or sell the sky, the warmth of the land?" This idea is strange to us. If we do not own the freshness of the air and the sparkle of the water, how can you buy them? This we know. The earth does not belong to man. Man belongs to the earth. You could replace man with human there. This we know. All things are connected like the blood which unites one family. All things are connected. And as he famously said, man did not weave the web of life. He is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. So if we destroy the land, we destroy ourselves. But if we regenerate the land, we regenerate ourselves. Isn't that amazing? This ability to dream this into being is now before us. We can take this planet and bring green back to its deserts, bring life back to its ecosystems, and humans can continue to be a part of the dance of life on Earth. Thank you. So that was the presentation. And what I'd like to do now is start a conversation, which is, I'd like to have a conversation with all of you about this topic of land ownership. And what I really want to say is that in my work previously with an organization called The Rules, where we were doing frame analysis and deconstructing the thought constructs of poverty, inequality, and environmental destruction, we discovered that the Algonquins had already found the cure. The cure, as Jeff McNeely has said here in the chat box, is creating agreements to inoculate ourselves against Wetiko. So that is our work. That is a really big part of our work. And so what I'd like to do now is I'd like to start a discussion with all of you. And I'd like to invite you to ask questions. And let me say this, that the framing of a question is a little limited. So if you don't want to just ask a question that I answer, you can also pose a discussion topic. And you might even say, I have experience and I'd like to share. So include in the ask a question box questions you'd like to answer or like to have answered or you'd like to discuss, or also topics you'd like to share yourself or stories you might like to tell. Because I know some of you on this call have a lot of experience with the types of solutions I was talking about. And you'll probably speak more eloquently than I will about them. So I'd just like to invite people to start writing in their questions or discussion topics in the question box. And as I said at the beginning, that anyone who asks a question can be invited into a conversation with a video chat. So when I see a question that I'm about to start answering or addressing, I will invite the person who asked it into a shared video conversation. If you are the person who asked the question and you don't want to come into video, just simply decline the request to join the conversation and mention in the chat box that you actually aren't going to join the video call so that I know more quickly and we use our time more wisely. So right now there are two questions in the Ask a Question box. The first one is by Ben Nates. And Ben is saying, I'd like to know how to apply land trusts. And Ben, I'm going to invite you into the conversation, so I hope you're able to join me. So I've just invited you. So Ben asks, or he says, I'd like to know how to apply land trusts to land-based rural communities to reclaim land, whether wilderness or farmland, from private ownership. How would one structure financing, legal status, and exit strategy for those who occupy and work the land? Are there existing prototypes? He says, that he's having connection problems. So, sorry, Ben, I just saw that part of the question. So I'll just start giving an answer to this. And I would say, if there's anyone else who feels like they can answer this question really well, just drop a comment in the Ask the Question box and I'll invite you in to discuss it, okay? Because I have some knowledge about this, but I think that others may have more. So how to apply this to entire landscapes? Well, let's do a sort of familiar model and then modify it. Probably all of us are more or less familiar with what the Nature Conservancy does. The Nature Conservancy invites people to donate money, and they also work with corporations and with philanthropic institutions and private individuals to pool money together, and they buy land. And then they just set the land aside. And they say, no one's going to touch this land. We're just going to let it regenerate on its own. So they set it aside and they don't touch it. Well, a modified version of that is to actively manage the regeneration of the land. So if you take something like the Nature Conservancy, which is basically building a land trust, what if you have a group of people that pool their money together in the same way and build an ever larger land trust? But some of the people who make investments might get their investments back out in the regenerative practices themselves. Now, one way to do this is financial return. If I gave $1 or $10,000, then as there are value creating activities, I get that money paid back to me. And I might have some reasonable agreement on some return on investment, like I invest 10,000, but I get back 11,000. But it's very important to structure it so that it's not extractive. So there needs to be a way of carefully structuring that piece. But it might be that it's not in financial return. I might actually want to invest to make an ecological impact. So I would like someone to measure the carbon capture and storage from reforestation. And I'm actually investing in carbon credits. So I could be a company that's paying for carbon offsets. And the carbon offsets are measured in the reforestation practices. So the ability to buy the land is paid for in carbon credits. So you can see it doesn't have to be money that's returned. It could be CO2 captured and stored in the bodies of the organisms and the plants. Another is to create livelihoods. Like you might have someone who works on a farm and they're doing regenerative agriculture, which is restoring the land base. And as they do this, they might get subsidized rent. So they may not own the land, but they get to live there rent-free or pay a very small amount of money. So maybe the land is like a 4-bedroom farmhouse, and they would normally have to pay $1,000 a month. But instead, because they're regenerating the land, you only ask them to pay $100 a month. And then the $900 that they're not paying is basically being paid back for their labor. So you're turning their labor into an alternative currency that doesn't have to have money involved. So you can see that this is just a general way of thinking, and then there are lots of financing tools for how to do this. And so what I would say is I'd like to ask if there's anyone else in this group who could answer this question better, and invite you to share what you're thinking. But that's my answer, at least for the moment. Let's see, I see that. Let me actually move on now to the question from Drew. So Drew, I'll invite you in to share the screen. And Drew is saying, in the context of land, what does strength look like? By this, I mean, what does it mean to not be controlled by the existing land ownership system without also joining and reinforcing this framework? Drew, I think you're joining. I hope you're joining. And I know that Drew has some land that your family owns. Oh, no, it's a different Drew. Drew. Oh, hey, that Drew. Hey.
Yeah, same one. Hey.
How are you? Good to see you. It's been a long time.
Good to see you too.
Yeah. How's it going? Let's talk about this. What are you thinking here?
Yeah, a lot of kind of where this question is coming from is a wondering about a lot of both the economic and legal system that exists right now is very good at. It's kind of like how on Amazon, like if you invent something new, Amazon will just copy it, and then they'll undercut your price and you'll go out of business. I'm wondering how I feel like there has to be some kind of parallel way in which that can exist in this realm, and what are effective ways of resisting that. And kind of through you addressed more after I asked the question, but I also had another piece that kind of connects to this, which is the decision-making process as well. I know a lot of efforts like this are trying to not have kind of the the really hierarchical kind of organization structure, but then it kind of can degrade into ineffectiveness, I guess you could say. And I've kind of helped out with some of those as well. So I feel like those are actually kind of related, and just kind of wanted to bring that into the conversation and see what thoughts there are about that.
Yeah, starting with this, those who have money and wealth now have a lot of power, and what needs to be done to counter that. One thing that I've observed during the time we've lived in Costa Rica and Colombia, and while traveling in Guatemala, because these are the only Latin American countries we've been to so far, is there's a lot of degraded land that has already been abandoned. And so you just see that decades ago, people came in, claimed ownership of the land, like I described, extracted and basically destroyed it. And then it became expensive for them to pay property taxes. And they weren't getting any beneficial value because they didn't have the imagination for an economic model. So there's a lot of land that is like this. So one of the strategies is to go to the places, this is sort of like what I would say about Detroit. You go to the place where the economy collapsed and no one wants to be there. And then you can go and create an artist commune and squat on the land. And eventually the city just gives you the deed because they want someone to live there and no one's going to buy it. And it's just abandoned. That there's real power in going to the unwanted places. It's a sort of Tai Chi move or an Aikido move. Go to the places that no one wants because the extractive system doesn't know what to do with it. But the regenerative system does. The regenerative system knows that you create value by just doing permaculture, just bringing circulation back into the land. The more you do that, the more it'll take care of you. So you get the returns by participating in that way. So part of the power of this is to go to the places that the extractive system can't see. So that's part of the answer. I don't think that's all the answer. Another is that because we're in a time where we're kind of peak everything, if you look at all the different, the trend curves of extraction, like here's copper ore, and then we use more and then we use more, and you watch the amount of it that they've discovered as it goes down and down. And then eventually you get to a place where this thing goes to a peak because they can't extract anymore and they can't recycle it, so the whole thing collapses or it drops down. We're in a peak time, which means that any model of use of things that doesn't recycle them will not be viable. Like there was sort of a period of temporary abundance for about 200 years where all of that was very foolishly used up. So there's no longer going to be power in just using things up. The power will be in the cleverness of reusing things. So these regenerative models will become more successful economic models because we're in a time of increasing scarcity of material inputs. So those who more wisely use those material inputs will have more viable business models. So part of the power becomes creating economic models that really are regenerative because they'll take care of themselves. And part of the way the power of this happens is the power of sovereignty and the power of self-reliance. If you don't depend on someone else, they can't exploit your weaknesses. Right? And like that was the enclosure movement. Kick the peasant farmers off the land in Britain, force them to work as laborers. They can't afford it, so they go to the city and they die in the factories. No one would have taken those lousy jobs if they weren't already desperate. So the creation of desperation is an essential piece of an extractive economy. So power comes by creating our own sovereignty. My family and my community can take care of ourselves. We grow our own food, produce our own energy, but the difference is the cooperation. The scale of cooperation that's needed, it turns out, is the bioregional scale. The scale of subsistence human communities is extended trade networks across the landscape. All historical sustainable cultures were structured this way. So this sort of, it's almost like a tautology. The thing that works is the thing that works. Here we have that there's a sustainable scale. Below that scale, it doesn't work. And this is our challenge around the other part of your question around decision making, is we have to use Elinor Ostrom's core design principles. There are 8 design principles for how to manage a commons effectively. Here, you're explicitly making the land into a commons, so you have to manage it effectively. Luckily, Elinor Ostrom figured out how to do that, got the Nobel Prize in economics for it. And so you can see that there's there's now a lot that's known about how to do this. And there are things like sociocracy and holacracy and various facilitation approaches. There's equity sharing models based on value creation. You could use something like blockchain to say we validated the process to be sure that it worked, creating smart contracts. The more you get into the different mechanisms, you see they're all basically doing the same thing, which is they are ensuring that there's trust in how decisions are made. And the people have set up the decision-making system so that however they're tracking that, the trust is being validated. And that's Elinor Ostrom's design principles. So that's, I think, a big part of how this gets addressed. I don't know, does that answer it well enough, or what else are you thinking? What's coming to mind for you as you're hearing that?
Yeah, it's a lot of kind of, I guess what I'm curious about is effective implementations of those systems. I know like Zappos has moved away from holacracy. I know there are effective implementations, but I'm not familiar, and I'm wondering if there are examples to research or become more familiar with.
Yeah, kind of my go-to example is the pro-social framework, just because I'm really familiar with it, and I know you've heard me talk about it occasionally before, which is basically Elinor Ostrom's principles for commons management together with multi-level selection for how any kind of organization in biology works, like you as a multicellular organism. And the part that I think is most powerful is actually the contextual behavioral science piece, which is acceptance and commitment therapy. There are specific tools where people increase their ability to regulate their emotions and find shared identity and shared purpose. So the facilitation tools of acceptance and commitment therapy, there's this 4-quadrant framework where everything above is visible behaviors, everything below is felt perceptions and emotions, and everything on the left is what you're attracted to, what you want to be more of, and everything on the right is what you're avoiding or what you want less of. And use this 4-quadrant framework to individually and in groups say, we want behaviors that are like this. We want less behaviors that are like that. We want people to feel and embody values like this. We want less embodiment of feeling and values like that. And you can use this 4-quadrant framework, which is called the acceptance and commitment therapy, or the ACT matrix, as a specific tool for doing this that you can do with any group. And there are a lot of specific activities that the pro-social community has created for doing this. So I think that's a really powerful way, is taking the unstated assumptions that people have and making them conscious and giving them body-based navigation tools. I know how I feel when I'm behaving the way I want to, and I notice how I feel when I'm behaving the way I don't want to. Get a marker in my body using these tools. And then I can guide myself toward the collective behavior, and we can guide together our group toward our collective behavior. And that's where like holacracy and sociocracy, when they don't work, it's because they're not implementing that well enough. So I think that's a super important question, and thank you for asking it, Drew. I'm going to go ahead and close off this, and we'll go on to the next question or the next discussion. Looks like you fell away as well. So thank you for that. I think that was really an important one. I see Gail is here with the next top question, and that Liz Connor is also asking about it. So Gail, I'm going to invite you into the call. And this one is, oh no, she says I'd rather not come on screen. I'm sorry, Gail, just read that. But I'd like to know if this could be a working idea for as small as an acre. I would say it's a working idea for as small as you want. And a way I might even prototype it is to say, if you have a backyard garden and there are 3 people in your house, how would the 3 of you share that backyard garden? You do exactly the same thing that I described. You would agree that it's shared. You would set goals for how you're going to use it. You would have decision-making tools for how you would manage it together. And then you would equitably share the value that's created. So if you can do that in a backyard garden with 3 people, then you can definitely do it with an acre of land, or as large or as small as you want. That's the beauty of this, is that I'm just realizing I didn't tag in the video where this question is being answered, is that this is a fractal phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that doesn't depend on a specific scale. Much more important than the scale is the process of imagining and understanding the narrative of ownership. we own this together. We have responsibility for it. We have shared goals for what we're doing with it. And we track the progress of how we're achieving those goals. And that can be done on any scale. So absolutely can be done at the scale of an acre, for sure. I see there's a question here from Brian. Miriam, if it's okay, I'd like to just wait on your question about more, where to learn about more prototypes, because I think some of those will just come up in answering the questions, and then maybe we return to it after we've covered a little more ground, if that's okay. So Brian, I'd like to jump on your question, which is, I'd be interested in discussing ideas with you about initiating co-ops and listing various forms of capital to facilitate ownership. So this one, if I'm getting Brian's drift here, is let's not just talk about it, let's start doing it. And I hope that's what we're about to talk about when you join the screen. In the meantime, while waiting and hoping you're able to join me, I would say this is something I'd like to see emerge in the Earth Regenerators study group. Actually, I'd like to see this emerge everywhere. So I'm really glad that you're bringing this up. So hey, Brian, how's it going? Good to see you.
It's good, thanks. How are you?
Doing great, doing great. I know you've done a lot of work with rural farming communities and sustainable food systems. And I'm curious how you see this conversation moving from idea to action. Like, what are some things we could start prototyping and trying out right now and in the next week and in the next month? Like, what do you
think? I think the process entails integrating various models. You've, of course, referred to pro-social or the Evolution Institute's 8 core principles, and I'd concur that any project prototype that's it's having the framework from a theoretical standpoint, that's a necessity to be able to translate into effective practice. I think, though, where things typically break down, and we've been using, utilizing different models. We found that the group, the ULab model as being a collective model, and as does pro-social, is really starts with a small group. So the ULab model. Sure. Hi.
It's my friend Brian. We're on a call with a bunch of people, all talking about how we can regenerate the Earth. So at least once I listen in. Please continue, Brian.
So the ULab model involves generally a group of 3 to 5 people as a core. And the core are principles, and I see the pro-social model as you really dig into that model and the application, working very, very well with that smaller group of 3 to 5 core members. So in our case, we're and somewhat following the Presencing Institute's lead at MIT, that they were looking for hubs that could have a regional footprint. So that tends to be where our focus is at the moment, in terms of putting together the best theory, integrating theoretical models, putting it into practice among that core group of practitioners, and then kind of building and expanding from that. So it's kind of a question or a process. What does as your prototype, you have your design, and you have a certain amount of consensus about what you're envisioning together, but then the practice, how the practice translates in your model prototype, actually taking on flesh, and how, and I think that relates to the earlier question also about scale, is that I see practitioners often are too myopic. It's sharing, a vision among that, right, among that core group. But that relational aspect is also the thing that is just so challenging. I mean, that's that, right out of the gate. That's the thing that's difficult to get right, and be able to sustain that and build on it.
Yeah, one thing that this is making me think is it would be really powerful to create something like a working group of people who specifically take the pro-social model and apply it to the formation of these cooperative land ownership projects, and then blend those two. So that any place where people are considering doing significant scale ecological restoration or building regenerative economic models, to actually create a focus on training in pro-social and employing it to set up each model appropriate to its place.
Pro-social, the principals with pro-social have done just phenomenal work over the course of just this last year. And so the pro-social model, as these principals have envisioned it, is literally just coming online as a prototype itself. But I too, I find that very, very exciting when you start to see some of the, I mean, it's David Sloan Wilson, kind of for example,
I've worked a lot with the people who created pro-social.
Right, I know you. I know you have, and I found the conversation that was hosted by the Mind and Life Institute between he and the Dalai Lama the latter part of October. When it's kind of funny. I mean, I think that you and I and others like Daniel Christian Wall share a deep appreciation for the role of culture in this larger picture, but working effectively in culture, there again, it seems to be, I have, my understanding of that is from an integral background that would define that cultural dimension as a shared collective of basically interior values and beliefs, and that's not what we're seeing in the current presidential nomination process, right?
Yeah, I see one of the essential things that needs to be recognized and then actively cultivated is the ability to work well in groups. And this is something that
exactly right. Yeah.
As soon as it's stated, it's like, oh yeah, that kind of matters. I've been in a lot of really dysfunctional. I've been an instigator of dysfunctioning groups. Like we start to get it. But what's really amazing is how these cooperative ownership models are explicitly understandable as commons. Probably the most stereotypical, if someone understands the commons at all, their stereotype would be some piece of land that is collectively grazed, or a watershed, or a river. So it's these physical landscapes. And what I found really powerful in bioregional design is that you let the functions of the landscape be your organizing principle. Mm-hmm. So if you combine those two pieces and then do pro-social, create functioning management systems, that's exactly what we're talking about.
Right. Yeah, there again, from an integral standpoint, in that lower left quadrant, the cultural quadrant, it's really about fit, and it's a sense of fit. It's not necessarily a fit that you can see, right? And this is why I think that the work, our engagement with the Presencing Institute over 5-6 years now has been, because it facilitates small group with a deep appreciation for the dialogue and also kind of the format that it takes. The big thing, unfortunately, that's lacking from these models and makes the integration difficult is, and I had a conversation, kind of informal conversation with a pro-social principal who recognized that a model of developmental hierarchy is not in that pro-social model, and that's quite a blind spot. I mean, quite frankly, if you don't, you know,
Yeah.
to have a small group even work cohesively, the respective identities are very important in that regard.
Yeah, Brian, thanks so much for bringing all this up, and you're really opening up, expanding the territory very nicely, and I really appreciate it. So thank you
for
that.
The chat.
Yeah, it's great to chat with you too. I wanted to just to mention before we go on that this pro-social process and the development of human psychological capacities, starting to feel like that might be what I suggest as the next webinar, because it's come up over and over again in the discussions. And what I want to do before going to the next question, which we'll get to in a moment, is I wanted to just introduce a quick poll to ask everyone how we're feeling. So I'm going to say, how does everyone feel? And what I want to know is, great, keep going. Feeling full, maybe wrap up early. Content to go. So I just dropped a poll in. What I wanted to, so you can see under the poll, it's going to answer this poll for me. How's everyone feeling? Because I just wanted to get a sense of whether we should go for an entire 2 hours or whether we should wrap up earlier. And so this will just help give me a feel for that. And I really like using these polls to just give us the chance to get a feel. And okay, so it's looking like we're sort of feeling like, let's just keep going for a little while longer. We may not go for an entire 45 minutes longer. We might go for another 20 minutes longer or something like that, since a couple of you are starting to feel full, but quite a few people want to keep going. And actually, one thing that might be really helpful is in the chat box, if there is a topic you would like to hear discussed that's not already in one of the questions, just drop that into the chat box right now. If there are any specific topics you'd like to have elaborated on or that haven't been talked about at all, just drop those into the chat box and I'll glance over at them before we continue. And then we can jump into the next question as well. And I see that, so I'll just have that as an open invitation. If you want to drop anything in the chat box, I'll see it as additional topics to throw to give attention to. And Miriam, I'm going to invite you into the screen now to start talking about your question, which is, where can I learn more about prototypes? And I'd like to just invite you in so we can chat together and you can share some of your thoughts and reflections about what we're discussing. So, so I hope you're able to join me. Looks like you're coming in. And I would say there are a lot of places to learn about prototypes. So we'll be able to, we've already sort of touched on a couple already with the Regen Network, the Black Sheep Resource Management. Anita's asking in the chat box about how to connect with other people in a local project. Anita, one thought I had while Miriam is joining us is that we can use things like the study group to define ourselves geographically, to create geographically focused populations. So that's one way, but there are also other groups, and this relates to the prototyping question too. So, Miriam, I see you're here. Hello, how are you?
Hi, good, thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I want to start by asking, you know, is this still the question that you wanted to discuss about finding more prototypes, or what else would you bring into the conversation for where you are at the moment? Since I know you asked that question a little while ago.
Yeah, well, I'm in Central America, and it feels like we're going through a second or a modern wave of exploitation or of the land and our resources. It's like we are now beginning to be the focus of North America in terms of what we have to offer, which is more like a beach and a place for resorts and things like that. And I have lived in nature for 6 years, and it feels now like us that we've been here, or our locals. I don't like that to use that term because it doesn't fit me anymore, because I feel I'm local of the earth, but it feels like we're being displaced from our land. And I have this urge for the first time to get a piece of land, to protect it, and to protect it from development and from destruction. And of course, it's not something affordable, because this wave of development is making the land very inaccessible. Specifically for us having salaries in Central America, it's not affordable. So I've been thinking in this idea for a long time, and now I feel like I'm pushed to jump off the cliff and start doing something about it, and like get a group together, or I don't know, just find resources or models or prototypes or any other examples of people that are already doing it, not only in Central America, but around the world. So it feels like it's the appropriate time for me, but I don't know basically anything about this. It's just a natural process in myself of reconnecting to nature that has brought me to this moment where I've learned from everything around me, like from the moon, the waves, the birds, and everything natural around me has put me here, and I feel it's time for me to do something. So it's
my first
basically
question is,
starting from scratch.
which country are you in Central America?
El Salvador.
El Salvador, okay. I spent some time in Costa Rica, and what was interesting was how the whole country is becoming sort of a neoliberal paradise retirement place for rich people from Silicon Valley to buy land and create gringo eco-villages. And
yes,
some of those are really good people. Like, I've met some of the people who are doing this, and it's not that they're bad people. Some of them are, some of them aren't. But it was very obvious the difference between the really lousy quality of education and especially in the rural places. The Costa Rican children in the country were getting a terrible education. And then right next to them were pieces of land being sold for $200,000 US. And so I saw this happening and was deeply disturbed by it as just another wave of colonialism by a different name.
yes.
So I think what you're saying is a very real, very pertinent problem. And one of the challenges that I see needing to be addressed very thoughtfully is how to cultivate the cooperation among local people. Because in many of these places, I don't know how it is in El Salvador, but here in Colombia, people have a long history of not trusting each other, and they don't work very well together. Same is true in Costa Rica.
Yes.
And it might be similar for you. How to cultivate that capacity to dream together and to collaborate, so that more and more people can do together what they can't do on their own, partly because of the inflated price of land. The thing about land speculation and the price of land is a chronic problem. Another place I saw this happening was on Vancouver Island in Canada, in British Columbia, where there are a lot of very ecologically minded people, but if you have to pay $1 million for the land to start a farm, yeah, Daddy's on the call. What do you want to tell me? My daughter really wants my attention. This is my friend Miriam.
Hi.
Ella es El Salvador. ¿Quieres decir hola? No. No quiere hablar. Pues she wants my attention. But I think that this ability to create trust between people, like we're doing right now, is I think the piece that needs to be developed most. That's nice. Oh, I hope he doesn't get hurt. Is he okay? No, he's getting hurt. Father duties are 24/7. That's our mother duties. And it looks like a cartoon, and there's Wow. Beep, beep. Is that what it's saying? Did you tell Mama? Do you want to go show Mama?
Yeah, but Mama doesn't know it.
Oh, go tell Mama. Go tell Mama.
But I don't know it.
No, no, you can tell me about it in just a little bit, okay, sweetie.
And
She's a good contributor.
there's a house.
She's lovely, yes.
And there's a house in it too. That's awesome. The house is a part of this. I think one of the ways to develop these models is to start to create a shared intention and vision among people while trying to build trust. So just having conversations with people about, like here where I am in Barichara, a big problem is no one can drink the water. So everyone has a water filter in their house, even though there's a water treatment system. Because if you drank the water, you would get sick. So we've all privatized the expense of unhealthy water. But if we all started talking about what would we do to have an affordable way of having drinking water, we'd restore the forest. That's what we'd actually do. But you need people who know that that's what's needed, and then start planting that seed and having conversations. And you can do it with families and just locally. So I think a lot of the prototyping is done in those conversations and recultivating that capacity to dream together. And then the other tools and frameworks, like there are 1,000 of them. But if you don't have this foundational conversation going, it just doesn't get anywhere. So I think that's like, it's often neglected, but is actually the most important. Does that make sense to you, or what is?
It does completely. Completely. One of the main problems that we have here is, as you said, it's because of the way we were conquered before, like our ancient tribes here. We don't trust each other. That's what was left. So we don't work as a community. It's hard to share one vision. It's hard to share one idea, and it's hard to have cooperation amongst the community. So it's easier once a foreigner comes, they trust the foreigners, but we don't trust in ourselves. So having this vision is it's the most important thing. And I think it's yeah, that's the most important part, starting to have these conversations. And I see now how important it is to have a framework for those conversations and not just take it like a superficial conversation. That I think it's a good beginning.
Yeah,
Thank you.
This goes back to the pro-social framework and why it's so important. How to create a shared identity and shared purpose among a group of people. That's actually the first step when Eleanor Ostrom defined 8 design criteria for managing a commons. Number 1 is shared identity and purpose. You know who is in the group, you know who is not, and you know what the group is for. And if you have that, then you've got the beginning of managing a commons. And then you need all of the other criteria about how to have fair decision making, how to resolve conflicts, and other aspects that need to be there. But if you don't have shared purpose and shared identity, then you don't have a commons. And so that's, and then figuring out what the commons, what this group of people is going to do is done by the group of people. So I think of that as more important than anything else. Now, the other frameworks for prototyping that we've already talked about are things like a land trust, basically creating contracts and agreements about how to use something together. And so think about, like, in your house, when you're making a decision about what's in the fridge, and you're planning on using that mango for dinner tonight, but someone wants to eat it now, you have shared agreements about how to use things. So it's the same basic idea. It's just that you're doing it for an entire landscape. And you need other support tools when you get to the larger scale. The basic idea is, and so, and actually it's sort of, like, I think one of the unlearning processes is for people to trust in their indigeneity, the fact that they do have indigenous backgrounds. In Latin America, this is a really big thing because most people have, like, I have an indigenous background somewhere in Southern Europe that I don't know about because it got erased. I lost my history. But a lot of people in Latin America know. It's like, oh, I'm actually connected to the Mayans, or I'm connected to the Kogis, or whoever. That's often known, and so you can go back to it and rediscover it, which is a huge asset. It's a really powerful thing. So I think that's where I would recommend focusing on the prototyping. And don't get caught up on tools and frameworks. You know, that'll come when the time is right. Yeah, is there anything else on this topic, or is this feeling perfect?
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to meet you as well. Thank you for being here.
Daddy, we're
Thank
taking
you.
to go.
Yeah.
I want to go on a bike with Johnny and I sit on the back of the bus.
At least let's go for a bike ride. That sounds like fun.
I'm
We
gonna
can do that pretty seriously. Now, I wanted to address this question now that Benjamin had asked. What about our notions of objects and subjects? I think I see where you're going already, but I'm going to invite you to the screen. And let's start it. Just to me, it seems slightly entangled with the idea of what detail. I think a good example is how we put so much power into objects like a car key. Okay, you know, rather than answering this, let's talk about it because I see where you're going. But I'd like to hear what you're thinking. Let's just start to unpack this because let me just begin by saying I think this is an important topic because there are so many ways that our minds have these categories that sometimes they help us, but in novel situations, we're in a very unusual historical context right now, that those categories don't serve us anymore. And so even if functionally useful at times, they're definitely not in this situation for a lot of our ideas. And so I wanted to dig into this with you. Like, what are you thinking here? And
yeah. So I've written some other thoughts, and I think it would be quickest from A to B, a straight line. We'll just talk about my personal experience with the segregation of different property lines. For example, I grew up on a farm here in, you showed that picture of all those fields, just open fields. Not allowed to be what it could be, but cornfields. You must be cornfields. And that kind of wears at your heart over time, driving by all that. But and around here we have so many old barns that are abandoned from the 70s because the Reaganomics, these farms getting bigger and bigger. And around here, hey Elise.
Elise wanted to show me she was eating a banana.
Oh, potassium. All right.
Do you want to show off your banana? Remember Benjamin, his daughter was here last time. And she had the little toothbrush.
I love it.
I'll continue.
Thanks for joining us, Elise. So the farms around here are getting so much bigger because, and a big concern is they're actually, this state is stepping in or putting the law down on labor payment to some of these immigrants that come up. And, labor costs are one of the biggest tragedies of our species, for the past couple hundred years, trying to get people off the land. And it, for me, it's, I have family in Mexico. So I have family, an hour apart, my wife's family, and we live, there's 3 different places that my life is. And the hardest one for me is knowing that the fish from the ocean won't be coming to where I grew up and caught frogs growing up in my lifetime.
Yeah,
because the amount of dams. Go ahead.
Yeah, one thing I'm thinking about this is like there's this weird psychological phenomenon that happens when we own something.
Yeah.
And, there was a line.
Us.
Yeah, there was a line from a song by the band Poison in the 80s. And I'm having an 80s moment for some reason. Where he says, "Who's riding who when you're in a race? Is the horse riding is the rider on the horse, or is the horse the one driving the rider?" And I think that's how ownership works. That once we separate ourselves from something, and then claim power over it, it also is kind of sneaking under the radar of our consciousness, the unconscious places, creates patterns of influence on our behavior that, in a sense, control us. And I feel like this is a really big problem in letting go of that model of ownership and control and coming back to a place of healthy relationship to control and power. Well, because one thing I'm feeling is you're saying, like, you drive down the road and see all the cornfields. I went to grad school in Champaign, Illinois, which was cornfields and soybeans as far as the eye can see. That I had no control over the fact that that's what was in the landscape. But honestly, neither did anyone else. Because if someone bought that land and put something else in it, someone else would outcompete them because they were in a gamed system, a rigged system. So there's a lot of perception of power and control that is sort of inverted. So when we think we have power and control by owning things, we actually often don't because of the way the systems are set up.
I remember listening to The Third Plate by Dan Barber. One of my most memorable parts, I couldn't find it. You know, warning to anyone listening to a book, anyways, the native said to the New Englander, not New Englander by that point, I think it was Midwest. He said, he showed him a root and said it's upside down, and it is. It's a backwards way of thinking. And another humoristic example is in William Cronin's New Changes in the Land. There was an example where the roaming cows were trampling the natives' Three Sisters plants, and then the natives called the New Englanders on their bluff and said, "It's your property. You're responsible for your property, right?" They give it right back to them, and I think also when you have mentioned about Tai Chi or something, it brought to mind I'm not sure if this term is out there, emotional agility, sarcasm, humor, but with compassion. I seem to, and I think a lot of people with sarcasm suffer from putting a cloud out there where people don't actually know what you're feeling or thinking. And if you don't, clean up the mess later, it can be pretty difficult, especially between family and friends. So I think it's important to consider, mimicking as an effort to understand someone else's position or where they're coming from emotionally. And I think too many times we fail to allow us to enjoy something that's funny or humoristic, and we miss the opportunity to grow.
I think that's like one of the aspects of this way of thinking about ownership is how so many of us have been in a low-level way traumatized by separating ourselves from the land that is actually an important part of our health and well-being. And we then build skills coping with that can play out in our emotions and in our language in lots of interesting ways. So sarcasm, in many ways, is an expression of having an impulse control that is not present. Like, I felt this emotion, I need to say something. When actually you say something, and then take something to be funny to cover it up. That's an interesting related phenomenon to sort of like an indirect consequence of this whole systemic pattern. But this is stuff that we can continue exploring and talking about as we delve in. So I see that people are needing to drop off the call, so I think it might be time for us to wrap up pretty soon. So great to see you again. I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, thanks for doing this, Joe.
Onward. And I was thinking, for the sake of the rest of the conversation, because I'm getting the feeling like people are starting to feel wrapped up a little bit, like we might be ready to be finished. I just wanted to finish this session by saying that one of the reasons why I felt it was important to talk about land ownership is that there are a number of things that are baselines as if they're normal, that people just assume are going to be the case as we transition to sustainability. Like, people live in cities now, so we'll live in cities in the future. even though living in cities is an extremely abnormal historical thing. Well, this idea of owning land, if you look at all of the human cultures in the history of humanity, a tiny, tiny percent of the cultures had this, and the indigenous cultures would call it a pathology. The Algonquin people said that Columbus was sick. He had wetiko. He had wetiko disease. And so if we recognize that land ownership is an abnormal cultural expression, then we don't just assume that it's going to be part of regeneration, but instead we get to a deeper place and ask, what do we actually need to do to regenerate the land? And part of it is moving beyond the mythology that humans are separate from nature, which is what makes it possible to own land, is that idea. So we have to deal with that idea and deal with land ownership at the same time. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope the discussion we've had today helps to bring more clarity to your own thinking about these ideas. And also, I hope that we can start to prototype and create some cooperative models of land ownership for regenerative projects as we move forward. And so I'd like to start wrapping up now and say thank you everyone for being here. It's been a really great conversation. And I look forward to hearing your comments and your feedback about how all of this is going and the study group itself, as well as in any conversations that we might have, if anyone reaches out for a one-on-one conversation. And just thank you for all of your time for being here. And let's keep doing all that we can to regenerate the earth. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday afternoon or finish of your morning or your evening, wherever you happen to be. And we will all talk again very soon. Right, thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.